Welcome to this workshop by the Master Gardeners of Nevada County. Our topic today is weeds, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Our presenters will be Susan Van Steenkist, Teresa Thomas, Darlene Ward, and Ann Wright. And now we'll begin with Teresa.
Hi, today's workshop, we're going to talk about the definitions and characteristics of weeds, history of weeds, why weeds are beneficial or a problem, common weeds, integrated pest management, weed management strategies, and prevention, which is the best weed management strategy. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So there's many definitions of a weed, and actually it's really personal. What you think is a weed is a weed. Any plant growing where it is not wanted. Weeds are plants whose undesirable qualities outweigh the good. They're out of place and not intentionally sown. And it's a plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. There's lots more that we need to know about botany. So while any plant can be considered a weed, there are some that are almost always regarded as weeds. Next slide. Weeds grow only in proximity to human habitation and cultivation. In other words, we invented them. They have no particular requirements for germination. They have special adaptations, and definitely more than one, for dispersal of seeds, extensive root systems, and they thrive in bare, disturbed, compacted soil. Next slide. The history of weeds, yes. Weeds followed the cultivation of grain crops from the Near East to Europe and were well established by 2000 BCE. Our human entourage included grains, weeds, rats, mice, lice, cockroaches, and domestic animals. And we still have them all with us. We hang out with such great company. The New Stone Age people would settle down in an area and build themselves a shelter and develop outside their shelter a dump heap, which is actually the scientific term. And that is where they would throw their refuse. And so, of course, the seeds in the refuse would hybridize, the refuse became compost, and weeds would thrive there. And then we transport them all the time on our clothes, in our shoes, on our horses' hooves, saddlebags, etc. It's really easy for them to get around. We encourage these plants by giving them the disturbed habitat that they need. They study weeds by looking at pollen, which has a plasticized outer coating that allows it to last for many years. Pollen is very lightweight and blows in the wind and scatters everywhere. So botanists and archaeologists go down through the layers of old lake beds and peat bogs, and layer by layer, and figure out what weed came in where, or what plant came in where. I think this is really fascinating, so they can get a whole timeline. In California, what they looked at was adobe bricks, because they're made out of clay and straw, and mixed in that there would be pollen. So in 1769, they identified 16 weeds here during the Spanish era. Between 1825 and 1848, 63 more weeds were introduced during the Mexican era. And then, of course, in the gold rush, 1848 to 1860, which was also the time of the big migration from all over the world and the rest of the country to California, 134 new weeds arrived. We now have 846. So next slide. So the benefits, it's interesting that we start with the benefits of weeds. I can't mute Richard. So because they bring up nutrients and water up to surface and down from the air, making them available to microbes and plants. We all have heard of nitrogen fixing And when you start thinking about a lot of our weeds, they are nitrogen fixers. They break up compaction and control erosion. They increase organic matter as they continually grow and die, creating humus. They provide habitat for microbes and animals. They attract beneficial insects. And they have nutritional or medicinal purposes, that some of which have been cultivated by us and other countries, and probably more for us to find out in the future. So why are weeds a problem? And basically for actually the same reasons that they're a benefit. They compete for nutrients, they block sunlight and steal water, they camouflage pests and diseases, they provide habitat for pests to overwinter, and they decrease crop yield. They share crop diseases, and they only get worse. You never hear of weed failures, you hear of crop failures. They can be fire and tripping hazards, and they can cause bodily harm to humans and animals. Some of our weeds are incredibly toxic, such as datura, foxglove, poison hemlock, poison ivy, pokeweed, oleander, stinging nettle, and jimsonweed. I read a book about death in the Grand Canyon. I think the name of it's Over the Edge. It was every death that has occurred in the in the Grand Canyon in recorded history, and what the cause was. And the only one that was attributed to drugs was a couple of young people who decided to experiment with datura in the canyon and managed to kill themselves. So next, yeah. So of course, besides hybridization and things mixing up, we have planted weeds that have become invasive. We have planted plants, horticultural plants, that have become weeds and can be invasive. And invasive implies that they're greedy, they tend to crowd out the native plants. And so they're not providing the nutrients, et cetera, that our animals and insects need. So they take over the native space. So some of them are Vinca major, which I had a neighbor who died about 10 years ago at the age of close to 100, who'd lived here all her life. And she said it was customary here in Nevada County to plant Vinca major over grave sites. So that's why you'll see Vinca major out in the woods in places that you wouldn't expect it, nowhere near a house. St. John's wort, which, gosh, it's all over Nevada City. It's not only invasive, it can be a fire hazard. Any plant with increased oil content, low moisture content, thin leaves, thin needles, fine needles, it's non-deciduous, that accumulates dead material under it can be a fire hazard. And I see all this St. John's wort around town, and I find it rather appalling. St. John's wort is one of those that reproduces many different ways. It has seeds, underground rhizomes, and when its branches touch the ground, they root. One plant can produce 100,000 seeds per year, which are viable for 10 to 30 years. Gosh. Anyway, then there's also English ivy, which is all over the place, euphorbias, yerba buena, and lamium, another of the common horticultural plants. Perennials that can be invasive: anemone, yarrow, hollyhocks, daisies. And you realize a lot of these plants are absolutely beautiful. Chinese lanterns, Centhranthus, or Jupiter's beard, which is also known as valerian. You'll see that all over. If you walk around Nevada City, you'll see that all over Nevada City with a gorgeous little flower and coming out through the rock walls. Acanthus, bear's breeches. Oxalis, which is a great ground cover, but it crowds out other plants, inhibiting the natives. I had this house remodeled a couple of years ago, and it has a small backyard, which was a lawn, and the workers used that as their staging area for their materials, their lumber, their tools, etc. And over the course of the 4 months, they managed to totally obliterate the lawn It has never come back, which I didn't want it anyway. But the Oxalis is still there in the corner, and it's actually quite attractive. Then we have our invasive shrubs and vines. I moved here in 1974 in May and had never been here, drove down Highway 20, and I saw all these bushes in this gorgeous yellow blooms and did not know that it was Scotch broom and that I would be pulling it for the next 47 years. Anyway, Himalayan blackberries were introduced here for their blackberries. It was deliberately brought in. Scotch broom, we have 3 brooms, the Scotch, the French, and the Spanish. And again, they can be a fire hazard. And in hot weather, their seed pods explode and shoot 20 to 35 feet into the air. In 1 meter of soil, they have found 6,700 Scotch broom seeds. I'm glad I didn't have to count those. They're viable for 8 years, and that wee book that we mentioned in this program, he says if you cut the Scotch broom below the ground as a way of getting it, or pull it with the reed wrench, you have got to maintain that area for 8 years to keep them away. Then there's honeysuckle and trumpet vine and wisteria, which are all planted and can tear down your porch or whatever. I had a friend who had a lovely wisteria, and when I complimented it, she said, well, if you plant it, you've got to be ready to control it. And I said, oh yeah, I can do that. What she didn't mention was the seeds that spread all over, far away from where the wisteria actually is growing. And then we have our invasive trees. Boy, Tree of Heaven was introduced on the East Coast in the 1700s as a horticultural plant. And in the 1840s, when the gold mining started, and later when the railroad came through and we had Chinese workers, this was a tree from China, which they loved, and it reminded them of home, and they planted it. If you go through Nevada City and you do the tree walk, which I highly recommend, there are some really old specimens of Tree of Heaven. It tends to, not only does it produce seeds, but it's a clonal reproducer. In other words, the roots that go out, shoots will come up directly from the root and spread like crazy. Very, very hard to get rid of. Also, mimosa and acacias were sold as horticultural plants in the local nurseries for the reasons that they're beautiful and they're fast growing. So people bought them, but they spread like crazy. I read that mimosa, the silk tree, is described as the wonderful, awful weed that you should prune anytime you have a chainsaw. They're also, Tree of Heaven is allelopathic, which means it exudes chemicals that discourage any other growth around them. So do redwoods, and black walnuts. And the last but not least is the herbs, which of course we all deliberately plant. And who would believe the little mint could go crazy? And I find them supposedly easy to contain, but I find them a little hard to pull out and keep in control. But mint, lemon balm, thyme, and oregano can all go run amok. So be careful what you plant. And now I'm going to pass you along to Darlene, unless you have questions, who's going to talk to you about identification. So are there any questions?
Okay, well, help.
Darlene, just 1 second before you begin. I will mention that we did have a comment, which I thought was useful, and I can turn it into a question for you, Teresa. The comment is that I'm reading to you now. I had the same experience with Scotch broom. I bought a home, and all along the driveway, it had beautiful yellow flowers. I've been pulling them all spring and summer. Glad to know it's a common story. And then here comes the question. I'm hoping some natives take its place in time. And I think you probably have a lot to say about getting rid of Scotch broom permanently and bringing in natives. So I can assume that maybe you're just going to cover those as we go along in the presentation. And so I'll just put that out there that there is a question about that.
Okay, yes, it does get covered.
Okay, so carry on, Darlene. Thank you.
I'd just like to comment, if we don't talk enough about native replacement, go to the recordings on the website and review the native plant workshop. That'll give you some ideas. You probably will need to do some planting yourself, not just wait for them to move in by themselves. Okay, now we're going to look at identifying weeds. Help, what is that weed taking over in my garden? Well, if you don't know what it is, you're not going to be able to eradicate it. But help is at hand. We're going to talk about 2 online resources and 2 books, and then I'll come to my favorite weed ID method. So the first one is the University of back up a minute, please. And thank you. The University of California IPM site. Look on the left. This is the home page. And you would want to click on the one that says Home, Garden, Turf, and Landscape Pests. When you click there, the page on the right pops up. It is filled with many active links with pests of all kinds, not just weeds. Oh, notice up on the upper right corner where it says Quick Links, there is a link to our pest notes. If you've never explored the pest notes, please do so, but we won't talk more about them on this workshop. What I do want you to do is look at the menu on the left and find Weed Gallery. Click on Weed Gallery and the next slide pops up. Next. Now on the left, here's the Weed Gallery. You can choose broadleaf plants, grass, sedge, aquatic. Just for the workshop, we're going to go under broadleaf and click on identification. Or if we wanted a long list of all the broadleaf weeds, we click on broadleaf list. Or if we weren't quite sure what a broadleaf plant was, click on tutorial. But okay, we clicked on identification and up popped the page on the right. You can select the plant form or maybe the mature leaf characteristic. Not the first leaves that come out, but the mature leaves. Let's choose roundish in the second row. And then the next page will pop up. Here we are finally at a page with plants that are presented to us. There are 15 different weeds. Hopefully you'll find the weed you are looking for here because these are the common ones. But if your weed isn't here, notice way down in the bottom right corner, it says Weed ID Tool. That's an active link. You can click on it. There are directions how to use the tool, and it may help you zero in on your weed. It does tell you in the instructions, don't try to answer all the questions, but we're not going to show you that one. Okay, we're ready to go on to the next slide. This is an online field guide, plants commonly found in our backyard. It includes weeds, forages, and some of the natives of the central Sierra Nevada. Well, it's also a good book for us in the northern Sierra Nevada. Plants are listed under thistles, grasses, trees and shrubs, vines, and non-thistle broadleaves. Notice the website. You don't need to write it down because it's in our handout, which is going to be posted on the Master Gardener site. Let's look inside and see what it looks like. There's a description of the plant, how the plant reproduces, where it is from, where it likes to grow, method of control, and at the very bottom, links for more information. This one is pokeweed, and it has recently been popping up in people's gardens, and I've had to field questions. What is this plant? Let's look again. Next. Here is another book online. I'm sorry, not online. This one is a brand new resource. It's a very small book, but it talks about all the invasive weeds in Nevada County. It has one charming feature. If you notice up in the upper right corner, that smiley face, Mattia is not an invasive weed, so they put a smiley face. It is one that is in contrast. It's a look-alike plant that you could plant because it is not invasive. It might spread a bit in time, but it's not considered invasive. You would get this book by actually going and visiting the Nevada County Resource Conservation District office, which is on East Main, and you'd have to look it up online. I looked at their website and they don't seem to list the book there yet because it was just published in 2020. I think they'll probably get around to having a link pretty soon. Next. Okay, now we're down to a bigger book. This one by Richard Orlando is Weeds in the Urban Landscape. Well, are we urban? Maybe, parts of our area, but mostly we consider ourselves rural. But his information is very good for all settings in California. He lists 10 important weed families. However, there are more than 400, maybe 450 or more, because it keeps changing, weed families worldwide. In California, we have about 200 different weed families, or families, plant families. This book gives you some histories, names classic weeds, medicinal uses, and folklore. The 10 important weed families, let's run through them, but I'll try to go quickly, and I'll just give you some of the highlights. First of all, plant families are grouped by characteristics. All these things are looked at, but in recent years, they've started using DNA analysis. And that is why the plant families keep changing, because even though the plants may not look like the other plants in the family, DNA analysis might say it belongs here. And so then they move it from another family to this family. And those of us who pay attention do get confused at times. However, recognizing the family that the plant belongs to provides a clue to where to start looking for pictures that will match the plant. Next. The first family he mentions is the Carnation family. You probably know that one. Carnation, Silenes, Rose Campion, Baby's Breath. The weeds in this family are chickweed and spurries. In this picture, chickweed is the lighter green color plant mixed in with the clover. It has little tiny white flowers. Looks like there are 10 petals in the flower, but it's because the petals of the flower are so deeply cleft that it looks like 2 when it's really only 1. It does have 5 petals. Next. The Composite family could also be called the daisy family or the sunflower family. Echinacea, marigolds, dahlias, thistle. So a lot of our garden plants, flowers, are in this family. However, we also have crops, lettuce, chicory, and artichokes. There are far too many weeds to mention, but I think you'll all recognize this one that's pictured here. Do you consider it a weed? Or maybe it's just a child's bouquet? Anyway, it's dandelion. There are other weeds that we can often find in our garden. One of them is the sow thistle. There's a prickly sow thistle and there's a smooth-edged one. I let one grow as long as it wanted to on my bank. Finally, it was over 7 feet tall. And look at that cluster at the top. All those buds with all those seeds to mature and spread around. I have to tell you, I took it down right after this picture was taken. Sow thistle does have milky sap too, which is of interest. To the right, there is one called milk thistle, and you'll recognize it. It's a large plant, but also it has white veins throughout the leaf. Rather picturesque, actually. And you can contrast the size here with the dog's paw. Next. Old Man of Spring appears in our gardens in the spring, rather early, and it does look like it's related to a dandelion. Look at those seed puffs, they'll spread if you don't remove it. And also on the right, we have hairy cat's ear. There's also a smooth cat's ear, and how will you know the difference? Well, you may not. Hairy is taller, smooth is a little bit lower, but they do line our streets in June with beautiful yellow flowers. Another family is the Amaranth family. It's often grouped with the goosefoot family. And in amaranths, you have love lies bleeding, celoseas, pigweeds. Historically, grain amaranths were grown for food because they had a high quality protein, and the leaves were cooked like spinach. I think maybe we're returning to using amaranth more now. The goosefoot family next has spinach, beets, sugar beets, chard, and quinoa, which again has that high quality protein. Notice that they have triangular leaves and there are tiny green flowers and spikes. And it's very deep rooted. Next. The grass family. It's one of the largest families. The daisy family is probably the largest family worldwide, closely followed by orchid, although some people say orchid is the largest, followed by the daisy family. But grass family is right up there too. It has many weeds: foxtail barley, orchard grass, crabgrass, Dallas grass, giant reed, Bermuda grass. Well, maybe you're using Bermuda grass for lawn, and that's good, but you have to be careful because it will spread, and maybe the next owners of the property won't want Bermuda, and it will be a problem for them. Same thing with bamboo. You need to grow it in pots or contain it somehow, and maybe buy the clumping variety rather than the running variety. Next. The mustard family, 4 symmetrical petals, and it includes wallflowers, alyssum, stalks, candytuft, money plant. The edibles are Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, broccoli, kale, cabbage, bok choy, and radish. There are many common weeds in this one. Let's look at a few. Little bittercress starts out early. Actually, it starts growing in the fall, but it becomes noticeable in January maybe. Lovely little plants with interesting roundish leaves. You'll see it there on the left. Then it finally shoots up a taller stalk, and again it has a charming little white flower with those 4 petals in a cross pattern. But then look what happens. The seeds develop. The seed pods, when they appear, I start removing this weed for sure, because when they dry, just the slightest touch pops them open, and it will pepper your face, pepper anyone nearby. So another name for this plant is artillery plant. Then there's the nightshade family, also called the potato family. Crops include potatoes, tomatoes, eggplant, and peppers. The ornamentals are petunias, nicotiana, angel's trumpet, Chinese lantern. In this family, some plants are truly poisonous. There's datura. Tomato leaves and roots are poisonous, not the tomato itself. Notice in the picture of black nightshade, there is a flower, a white flower. This is the typical flower for this family. The black nightshade fruit is about a ½ inch across. When it's green, it's highly toxic. When it's ripe, some people will cook it with multiple changes of water to remove the toxins. I prefer just to leave it alone. Then there's the parsley family. These have hollow stems and very deep tap roots. small flowers and umbels, and dissected leaves. It includes a lot of herbs, and the flowers attract beneficial insects. The weeds are fennel that has escaped from gardens, poison hemlock, and Queen Anne's lace. Let's look at the next slide. Here's poison hemlock. It has a neurotoxin that causes paralysis and respiratory failure, and all parts are poisonous. It'll grow 6 to 10 feet tall. The leaves are large and very fern-like, and it has white flowers in umbels. You need to be able to differentiate it from wild fennel and Queen Anne's lace, and the fennel will have yellow umbel flowers. Looking closely at poison hemlock, the hallmark is a spotted stem, a purple spotted stem. It may have a mousy odor also. The umbels are smaller than many, and it will actually like to grow in moist places primarily. Here's a close-up of poison hemlock umbels on the left and Queen Anne's lace on the right. Right now, there is a lot of Queen Anne's lace blooming along our roadways. If you have a chance to stop and look at one closely, you will see a tiny dark red or black flower in the middle. Maybe it won't be in every single one, but most of them have it. Children used to call that the ruby in Queen Anne's lace. Tradition says that Queen Anne was making lace and pricked her finger and a drop of her blood fell on the lace. But anyway, it's intriguing. We don't know the purpose of why there's one black flower. It's been suggested it maybe gives pollinators a hint of where to target. Next. Hedge parsley is another rather annoying weed. It sends up tall stalks with these kind of ferny leaves, but it starts out with a tiny plant that looks a lot like a California poppy. And you have to learn to differentiate. It'll be a little darker green than the California poppy. It may be very prolific like the middle picture. And when it sets seed, the seeds look like little tiny burr clovers. Yeah. Anyway, we'll look at them in the next slide. Here is the seed when it dries. It is the seed that destroys socks, so it's called sock destroyer. Next. The pea family. Typical pea flowers have 5 irregular petals, 1 chambered seed pods that have seams on the top and the bottom. Ornamentals are lupins, brooms, sweet peas, wisteria, locust, weeds, clovers, burr clovers, vetches, some acacias, and brooms, which Teresa mentioned quite fully. Here's a picture showing how densely Scotch broom can grow. Next. The rose family. This has 5 petals in a regular pattern on the flower, many stamens in the center. They are vigorous plants, and the birds often transport seeds around. Includes roses, pyracantha, cotoneaster, red-leafed plums. The crops are fruit trees and strawberries. And then those weeds are the dreaded Himalayan blackberry and escaped ornamentals. However, in a good year when there's been plenty of water, the Himalayan blackberries are delicious if you can find a patch that you can pick away from the busy roadway. Next. Now we're down to what I called my favorite way to learn or identify. And this is learning by observation. You get down on your hands and knees and look closely at the details of a plant. Maybe you just need to work alongside someone who shares their knowledge of weeds. And you can look at lots of pictures in weed books. You can take a photo of it and send it to the Master Gardener website, Got Questions. Later on, we'll have the hotline. Some people use plant ID apps on their cell phone. You can put it in a sample in a bag and take it to the nursery, but mostly just look carefully. Here at this prickly lettuce, I would notice, deeply lobed leaves going up on the stalk in an alternate pattern, very tall and slim. Oh, but look on the back side of the leaf. What is that row of teeth? That's the key. If I see the row of teeth on the back side of a leaf, I know that it's a wild lettuce, and I'll start looking to see which one. Next. Here are two plants that you might have. Field bindweed looks like a little morning glory, but it isn't. It has a network of roots all from one plant way underground. You can pull it out here and pull it out there, but it's going to pop up again somewhere else because the roots are still there. If you leave behind even a 2-inch segment of the root, it's going to start growing again and make another plant. Here's spring vetch on the right, and I would identify it by flowers in the nodes, and the seed pod looks like a pea family, right? And then the tendrils on the end. Spring vetch is often used in a cover crop, and so it has escaped and appears all around. Next. Then we have filary, which is sometimes called stork's bill. The key here is to look at the seeds. The long-tailed stork's bill splits apart into 5 seeds, and notice how twisted they are. They alternately curl up when it's wet, and they unfurl when they're dry, and they drive the seed into the ground. There are other filaries that do that too, so you'll need to identify which one. You may want to look more again at the leaf pattern. Next. Creeping wood sorrel. I think this is the one that Teresa mentioned. It can be green or it can be purple, and it has these little white flowers. The thing to know is you need to get all the roots out, because if you leave a little bit of root behind, it will resprout. And then here's spotted spurge over on the left side. Actually, there is one that just looks the very same, but doesn't have the blot of color on each leaf like spotted spurge does. It's kind of a thin leaf and a little bit dry. The thing to watch for are the little flowers that appear in all the leaf axils crowded together, and a very small plant of this starts setting seed. So if you don't want it to take over, you need to get it out early. It is not edible. If you tried to eat it, you would have severe stomach upset. But on the right, we have common purslane, and it is edible. It's often used in salads. It can be cooked. And the key for it is a single yellow flower in the axils and fleshy, succulent leaves. Next. Here are two that I have in my yard. The one on the left is cut leaf geranium. It was very prevalent this year. And the leaves are deeply lobed, and it is a stork's bill. But when you look at the stork's bill, it's stubby, and it has those rounded seeds down at the bottom. On the right is henbit, sometimes called giraffe's head. These flowers are quite small, so you need to really get down closely to look. But I think this is the prettiest weed in my yard. Next. Here's common knotweed. It is now taking the place of some of the other weeds. It's wiry, it's dry, and it has a very deep taproot. It's hard to pull out. And then there's burning or stinging nettle. Notice the deep serrations on the leaves, and it has a square stem. And if you get against it, you'll know why it's called burning or stinging. So are all weeds non-native? No, we have a few native weeds also, the nut sedges, and miner's lettuce is either welcome in your yard or else it may be that you call it a weed. And then there's poison oak. And remember the saying, leaves of three, leave it be. Well, we have other natives that have three leaves. Maybe that doesn't work as well. I'd like you to notice the long stalk at the bottom of the central leaf, and then the two on each side. The Boy Scouts said, two are kissing and one is running away. The running away one has the stem on the bottom of it. It would be the center one. Next. Just to summarize, major weeds in Nevada County would be star thistle and Scotch broom. Star thistle has a 4 to 6 foot deep taproot, which pulls water away from other plants. It will keep germinating as long as water and light are available, and it won't tolerate shade. My first experience with it was actually, I think it was Montana on a trip, and I wanted to go to the top of a hill along a river, and it was full of star thistle. I learned that you don't want to walk through a field of star thistle. Look at those pines. And Scotch broom, interesting, that was brought to California to stabilize dunes. Well, we don't much like it here anyway. Next. Are there any questions? Be sure to submit them to chat. And if we can move on, Susan's going to tell us what to do about all these weeds.
I have one question that maybe I should have you take now, Darlene, and then we'll go to Susan, if that's okay.
Fine.
I was posting some screenshots from the presentation over to the Facebook page of Nevada County Backyard Gardeners, and there's a very active native plant grower there. And so when I posted the slide of potential invasives that included yerba buena, he was quick to ask, well, which yerba buena? Because we have two natives. So I'm not sure if you can answer that now. We may want to add it later, but is there one of the or more of the yerba buenas that's the one that you consider a potential invasive?
I don't think I can answer that one. I'm sorry, but I haven't any experience with it. But while Susan's talking, I'll see if I can find an answer in one of the books.
Okay, and I'll send you a little thing in chat with the names of the two species that he referred to as natives. All right, Susan, please carry on. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to talk about some of the tools for weeding. We've talked about all the different families, and we need a little help here with this.
Okay.
I do want to remind you about the IPM website. It's we've gone into a lot of detail about this, so I'm not going to repeat it, except to remind you that this is one of your best tools. It helps you identify, know how to control it. Wonderful advantage for you. You have to look at weeds with prevention versus reaction. Prevention would be understanding just kind of what the life cycle is. In an annual weed, you want to control the sprouting weeds and to prevent it from seeding, because once it seeds, it's going to be there for, as long as the seeds are viable. With the perennials, you need to get the root, because if it seeds, that's okay, but it's going to come back up from the root. So knowing which type it is, an annual or perennial, is very good. With annual, if you can pull it up and keep it from going to seed, that will help to reduce its spread. Reaction, set your own goals. What can you live with, or what is your aggravation threshold? How do you want to spend your time? Pulling it up by the roots is a mechanical method of control, but especially with the grasses, that really does help with that. And this is my favorite tool for grasses. You can really get in, grab them and yank them back. And this tool is called a wedge puller, a wedge weeder, I think. And it's really one of my favorite tools, probably handy for a lot of other things, but we won't go into that one. So with the perennials, if you can wait till after a rain or a moist soil, that's much easier to pull. You grab, twist, and you want to get as much of the root as you can, although realistically, you probably aren't going to get all of it for some plants. Now, an annual, some suggestions might be hot water or a flame, but you have to be sort of careful with that. Again, you want to control before the seed dispersal. Frequent mowing might be your best option with that. How do we prevent weed growth? Don't overwater. Keep it, to a minimum, which we should be doing anyway. Avoid soil compaction, because this opens up the area, reduces competition from other plants. Perfect venue for weeds to colonize. Avoid rototilling for most circumstances. And I will go into more detail about why that can be a problem. Don't mow your lawns too short, because being too short, less than about 4 to 6 inches, opens up the area, your ground, to sun and water, encouraging weed growth. Soil preparation is really important. If you want to get rid of the weeds, some people use a solarization, some people use lasagna gardening. They're two different techniques. These are slow though, and you need to leave it in place for 2 or 3 seasons. Again, you could start using rototiller here to break up your soil initially. But remember, when you break up that soil, you're bringing those seeds and the viable roots up to the surface. And so you've destroyed the first crop, but you really haven't done much for the second. That's why rototilling is not so beneficial. It also disrupts your normal ecosystem in your soil with the fungus and the bacteria growth. Cover crops are very useful to crowd out the weeds, and they do bring nutrients to your soil, so it's a very useful technique for many reasons. Herbicides. Well, the herbicides, I like to use those as a last resort. I really prefer using some of these tools. This is really a great one for particularly dandelions, anything with a deep taproot. This is a hori knife, very useful knife in general. It's got a serrated edge. You can get down, you can get the roots. It also is very useful for planting, and like container pots, you can get in without disturbing the soil too much to remove plants. So it's a good tool to use. Can't go wrong with your grabber here. So it kind of helps till the soil and pick up the roots. But again, this is my favorite tool. If you feel like you absolutely have to have the herbicides, read the label, follow the directions. The reason we started with the scene with the hazmat suit is that many of these are very poisonous, kill a lot of things around the surrounding area. So we want you to be very, very cautious with this. There's basically two different types. There's a pre-emergent, which kills the seeds, but can affect other plants. So you need to be careful. This works like with graveled areas, garden paths, things like that. Post-emergent, this is where you really need to know the type of plant you have, because some of these are designed for broadleaf, others are designed for grasses. That's why focusing on the growth of the plant is helpful in selecting your herbicide. Remember, Roundup is going to kill everything, so it's very non-selective, and it can be very hazardous to a lot of the other things. You want to be really sure you follow the directions on this one. Other widely used herbicides, including your glyphosate, your dicamba, or your 2,4-D. These are especially good for poison oak and blackberry. Sometimes that is the only thing that you've got to use with these. Read the label. How many times do I have to say that? Please read the label and follow the directions carefully. Avoid direct application, use direct application as best you can to the affected plant, because as I say, it's going to kill everything surrounding. Be sure that you don't apply this on a non-windy, or apply on a windy day, because the wind will scatter it not only to other plants, but to you too. Be sure and wash your hands after use, and yeah, I would even change your clothes. If you're going to use glyphosate, be sure you dilute it according to directions, or just buy the pre-diluted, which is probably the safer venue. Now, do you really want to eradicate all the weeds. We've talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly aspects of the weeds. There are many benefits. They use the deep tap roots, they break up the soil, they bring the nutrients up. They're wonderful pollinators. Dandelions and henbit are some of the first ones that bloom in the spring, which provide pollen for the bees. They do help control erosion, and perhaps a mixed lawn with some oxalis, maybe some different grasses might be really more attractive. They do provide habitats for our insect and bird populations. They provide hiding places, seeds for nutrition. They really act very strongly for pollinator support. You can plant some of the grasses in an area to crowd out undesirable plants like your dandelions and star thistle, but it's a long, slow process. Support your healthy horticulture plants that you want in the area by supporting their health. You want to have good soil. You want to be sure that you water appropriately. You want to mulch heavily, but remember not to mulch really close to the trunk of like big trees and things like this. It's a good idea to really check your soil moisture than just routinely watering as, according to your timers, because during this time of our drought, we need to be really respectful of this. I compost about once or twice a year, again, to support my soil microbiology. What I'm doing is supporting my soil health, which again, supports my plants. Loosen the soil with a turning fork or a broad fork. Again, avoid routine use of a rototiller. Now, other ways of controlling it would be by a competitive planting. We want to look at cultural control in addition to some of the mechanical control. I've talked about some of the mechanical things with the tools, but other things you can use are weed cloths, cardboard boards, well-maintained mulches, isolate your drip system to reduce water to the weeds. Again, remember your IPM websites will help you with any turf management issues. I can't emphasize mulching enough. Mulch, mulch, mulch. Even if it doesn't keep the weeds from growing, it's easier to pull out. For further information, I want to remind you about the other resources that we have. And again, many of these are on our website and they have been discussed in detail earlier in the program. I want to remind you just to look at your aggravation factor and consider how you want to spend your time, pulling weeds, living with weeds, or doing something other a little bit more fun. Thank you very much for your attention, and we welcome any questions that you might have.
I want to circle back to a couple questions. Let's go back to the original question about broom.
Other than pulling it out by the roots and keeping it from pollinating, Darlene, you might be able to answer. I believe it's a perennial, isn't it?
I think so. Yes.
So that's why you really need to get it out by the roots. There are many companies that do specialize in these noxious shrubs like blackberry and poison oak and other type of removal systems, because it is a major problem and very difficult to get eradicated completely, but pulling it up by the roots is your best option.
Great. All right. Thank you. Is it realistic to think that if you remove a weed plant, that it'll open up an opportunity for a native to take its place? Or do we need to be more proactive than that?
I think we'd need to be more proactive as soon as you pull it up. Now, what I have a huge patch of star thistle in my pasture that I've been trying to eradicate, and I've tried to keep it mowed, and I've overseeded it with some foliage seeds. And then, but the interesting thing about the star thistle, there is a herbicide that you can get, but you have to apply it very early when it's in its rosette form. It looks like just a clump of grass, broadleaf leaves clustered around a central area, a root. These roots can go down, as Darlene mentioned, 4 to 6 feet when they get going. But as it grows, it becomes that grayish green color that we so typically associate with star thistle. If you spray it during the rosette with herbicide, you have a better chance of eradicating it. But again, what I've tried to do is, early in the, late winter, early fall, something like that, when I think I'm going to have some rain. I overseed heavily, thinking that maybe these will crowd out the seeds. So, but I do realize this is going to take me 2 or 3 years at least.
Sylvia, on a response to that Scotch broom question, I would guess that it would depend upon the size of the area. If it's a small area and you can pull the broom, moisten the soil, pull the broom out with a weed wrench, and then plant. I looked up and there was some suggestions for like California flannel bush or any of the rebies, the currants. Now, flannel bush would be if the area is dry, and the other one be if the area is moist. And then prevent any disturbance of the soil under those bushes, keep it well mulched. Then you might have a chance of keeping the broom from coming back.
Great, that's very helpful. Anybody else want to chime in on broom before I go to the next question?
Well, this wasn't on broom, but
I'm Ann Wright. I've been sort of behind the scenes, but I wanted to just interject that at the Nevada County Resource Conservation District, whatever, I think they might even rent those weed pullers for Scotch broom. They have quite a, I think on their website, they may have some information about eradicating Scotch broom. So check in with them for more information if you'd like to.
Oh, one thing I just wanted to point out, as I mentioned, our emphasis was the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the one caller was asking about a yerba buena. Personally, I look for the yerba buena because it's a good ground cover, grows in dry shade, and deer don't eat it. So what's not to like? It smells good when when you have to kind of control it.
okay, I was looking it up, and I guess it was very, very prevalent in the Bay Area originally. And yes, it does grow here some. It will maybe form a mat 6 feet, but it roots where it touches the ground, and it would be very easily controlled.
And it really does smell good, makes great tea.
Right, and I think it was on our list because it was the book Urban Weeds, and he was writing it for his classes in the Bay Area. So sorry for the confusion.
How would you suggest removing a lot of bindweed in a lawn of rhizomatic tall fescue, since they like similar growing conditions?
Honestly, I think if it's not a real big area, I would lasagna, garden, I put a lasagna area in, where you stack different, you put cardboard, you put compost, and you kind of layer it and smother it or solarize it, because the bindweed is going to mix, those roots they live forever, I do believe. And they're just going to be there in the same habitat with the other roots that you want to prevent. I would just start all over personally. And then I've solarized it, then I would just plant what kind of grasses you want on top of it and start all over, unless somebody else has some other ideas.
Well, at my place, I
List
just
an
simply,
herbicide that you could use with that. I'm not sure.
I keep pulling it out because it's in an area where it's somewhat limited, but I did research it, and it has 2 different kinds of roots. They can be just under the soil type roots, and then there's a deeper one that could go down 20 feet.
20 feet.
So I realize I'm just going to have to pull them in that area. It's not widely, it's just not I don't have acreage. But I think that somebody else mentioned they finally resorted to the dreaded Roundup. And, we don't recommend doing that. We recommend hand pulling more. But in some cases, it depends on if he really needs to protect the grasses there, he would have to protect them from Roundup too, because it'll kill everything.
And that's why I suggested sometimes you just need to start all over if the bindweed is that much of a problem. But, you know, if you're going to mow it and kind of keep it under control and let it sort of blend in with your grasses, well, maybe that's your answer. You just have a multi-hued lawn.
This is about woolly thyme alternatives. The question is there an alternative to woolly thyme? I had wanted to plant it for ground cover, but I'm grateful I listened to the Zoom today. I did not know it was invasive. So what's an alternative that would work in those same conditions?
Well, before we consider it something you don't want, I would just look and see how easy it is to control, because it's a marvelous ground cover. You can walk on it fairly well. It does cover densely. It crowds out other weeds. So in a way, it really will help you with whatever ground cover projects you're working on. And I find it pretty easy to pull up if it's somewhere that I don't want, but I'm not sure I would consider that a noxious sort of weed personally. What about the rest of you?
I agree with that.
I think it's a fast grower that if you want it, it's good. And
Well,
I think the point was if you don't want and you don't contain where you are growing it.
Well, and it doesn't need much water
No.
and tolerates, it likes sun, but it does tolerate some shade, some light shade.
And you can walk on it.
I think it's great personally.
Yeah, me too.
So folks, I think we're finished today. I'll just mention that this has been recorded and it will be on our website in a week or so. So we'll have some handouts with resources and other information.